All right, so I'm going to be going over an opening that you can use against bird's opening. So everyone knows bird's opening. We have pawn to f4. Uh, Generally, at the top level, it's not the most ambitious opening for white, but certainly if you are, under 2200 or even better than that, especially in blitz, f4 can provide an opening with plenty of aggressive attacking chances. White can adopt a lot of different setups. This knight usually comes to f3. You can play pawn to e3 and develop this bishop either to b5 or to e2. A lot of lines there is pawn to b3 and bishop to b2. A lot of different setups that white can choose. And especially in blitz, this is a pretty annoying weapon to face as black, but I have a very interesting opening to try against it, and it is pawn to e5. So this is known as Fromm's Gambit, um, but I want to take it a step further. So white can obviously decline this and play pawn to e4 and take it back into a king's gambit, which is perfectly fine. Nothing to be scared of with the king's gambit. There are a lot of good options. You can take on f4, you can play pawn to d5, you can play bishop to c5 and decline it. There's a lot of different stuff that you can do, but generally the king's gambit is not the most scary opening to face as the black pieces. So in this line, we're going to go over pawn takes e5. And it's very easy for white to find himself in trouble here. And the move that I'm suggesting here is pawn to d6. So you're going to gambit a pawn if if white wants to take it, and you're going to develop your bishop and get some serious counterplay. The whole point is white has played pawn to f4 and weakened his king by moving this pawn in front of his king. So you want to try and take advantage of that, and this can be a very good blitz weapon. So here, let's just go ahead and take a look at what happens if e takes d6. If white wants to get really greedy, white can find himself in a lot of trouble. So you could play bishop takes d6 here, but the move that I'm going to advocate for is called knight f6, and this is called the Langheld Gambit. I didn't know that this actually had a name. I've known about this opening for several years. I did an analysis on it a couple years ago because I used to play bird's opening quite a bit, and this e5 line is one that scared me a decent amount. But knight to f6, so you're giving up yet a second pawn on c7 if white wants to take it. So there are other moves you can play. White can play knight to f3, knight to c3. There's a lot of different things that white can do here, but I'm gonna go in for what happens if d takes c7 is played. So here you play queen takes c7. White has a lot of different moves. The best move is technically pawn to e4. If white doesn't know what he's doing, there's no way he's going to play pawn to e4. That's kind of a difficult move to see because it looks like it can be taken. I wouldn't recommend taking it if e4 is played. You should probably play bishop to d6. But nevertheless, e4 is technically the best move along with d4. They're both pretty reasonable moves. But I'm going to show what happens if knight to f3 is played. So bishop to d6 is a good response. So you get this battery going along this diagonal, and you look to play knight g4. So that's kind of the hallmark of this opening. You've given up 2 pawns, but you've opened up the e and the d files, and you've gotten some serious pressure along this diagonal, and you look to play knight g4 and take advantage of white's lack of development and weak king position. So pawn to e3 is generally played. If white doesn't choose to play e4, e3 is probably the most logical response, and black is going to play knight to g4. So this knight to g4 move can be really, really annoying. The main idea is really to just apply maximum pressure over here on the king side. So white has weakened these dark squares around the king side, and white is severely behind in development. You want to castle king side as white, but when you apply this kind of pressure along this diagonal and with the knight, you really can't castle king side in really any case. And you're at least 4 moves away from being able to castle queen side. So white's king is going to be in some serious trouble here. So white is either going to have to keep the king in the center or somehow manage to get through 4 moves before being able to develop queen side. But basically you can just take a look here. I mean, you can just see all these queenside pieces completely undeveloped. Even this bishop and this rook, everything is undeveloped. Black has a serious lead in development here. And really the best move here for white is definitely to play bishop to b5 check and just try and develop pieces with tempo to try and catch up. So here, if something like bishop b5 is played, you can just play knight to c6, and it doesn't fully fix white's problem. So queen to e2 is a reasonable resource here, but even here, there are several options for black. You can castle kingside, or you can play bishop takes h2, or knight takes h2. Knight takes h2 is probably more accurate, and if something like knight takes h2 is played, you can probably just play bishop takes h2, and if something like queen to h5 is played, you can play bishop to g3 check and just keep this king in the center. And black is going to be doing pretty well here, I would say, with the lead in development. Yes, black is still down a pawn, but the lead in development is definitely good compensation. Okay, so going back, if instead of bishop to b5 check, which is most likely the best move, if something like bishop to e2 is played, white can find himself in some serious trouble already. Something like bishop to g3 check is even possible. If bishop to g3 check is played, king f1, and then something like knight f2 right away can be played, as well as bishop takes h2 here in this position. This can be very good because if knight takes h2, there's queen to g3 check, king f1, and queen f2 mate. So it's very easy to get in trouble here if you're white. Something like bishop e2 is not the best option. Knight to c3 is also a possibility here, but once again, this bishop to g3 move is a bit annoying. If something like h takes g3, there's queen takes g3, and if king to e2, queen f2 check, king d3, this can lead to a very interesting game after castle kingside, and this king does not look like it's in a particularly good spot. White can't really develop the queen side, and there are some major attacking possibilities in this position. If something like king to c4 is played, there's bishop to e6 check, but there's also, you can play queen to g3 and try and reroute the queen back into the position. I don't really like white's chances of trying to survive this position with the king on c4. So bishop, or knight to c3 does not really uh, seem like the best option for white because after knight to c3, this bishop to g3 check move is going to be really annoying and force the king on this king walk, which I would say in blitz is probably very, very difficult to defend as white. So this is a good thing to keep in mind as black. I'm going to be going over just a quick example of how effective this opening can be against Bird's opening. So this was a 3+0 blitz game playing a roughly 2000 chess.com rated player. And let's just jump right in. So we have pawn to f4, pawn to e5, he takes the pawn to d6, he takes that pawn, knight f6, and he even chooses to take the third pawn on c7. Queen takes c7 was played, knight to f3 was played, bishop to d6, forming this battery along this diagonal. Pawn to d3 was played, a slightly different approach. My opponent is looking to play pawn d3 and pawn to e4. Maybe he wants to play bishop to g5, but I don't think he's really prepared for this knight to g4 plan that I'm going to employ. So we have a knight to g4, and then my opponent tries to play pawn to e4. Maybe there's a timely e5, but not right now. And at the moment, this pawn on h2 is hanging, so I go ahead and play knight takes h2. Bishop takes h2 is slightly more accurate, but this move works as well. Knight takes h2 is played. I give a check on g3 to make sure that white's king remains uncastled. King to d2 is played. I give a check on f4. King to c3 is the only move. If you go to e2, then queen to f2 is checkmate. So king to c3 is really the only option here. So I give a check on c7 to see if my opponent wants to repeat and go back. And then my opponent chooses to play king to b3. And then I give a check on e6. Not the most accurate move, but it works. Pawn to c4 is played. Bishop takes h2. Queen to h5. Looking to take this bishop on h2. I play bishop to e5, just retreating my bishop. Yes, there's a lot of pressure here on h7, but I do not have to castle yet, so I'm not going to. My opponent plays knight to c3. Knight to c6 is played. Bishop to e3, just trying to develop the pieces. And I play a good move here, pawn to b5. trying to take advantage of this pin here. If knight takes b5 is played, that this would not work out in his favor. Rook to b8 would be a very good response, and this pin would be lethal if you play rook to b8 here. Even a4 doesn't save it because pawn to a6, and this knight is going to be a goner. And if you don't play a4, then rook takes b5 is a serious threat. So instead of taking on b5, my opponent chooses to play rook to c1. I take on c4, d takes c4, rook to b8 check, king to c2, and I play queen to a5. So I'm setting up some nasty tactics here. I'm expecting my opponent to go king to b1. I'm also potentially at the right moment threatening some sort of bishop takes c3 stuff. I do have to keep in mind that the queen is over on h5, but my opponent plays king to b1, which is what I expected, and I hit him with the nasty rook takes b2. And this is a very nice tactic to take advantage of the weak king position and the fact that this bishop is undeveloped, this rook is in the corner, and this queen is completely off sides. These bishops do a good job of cutting off connection with the queen to the queen side over here. And rook takes b2 is a very well-timed sacrifice. So we have king takes b2, queen to b4 check. If you go to c2, I will take on c3 with the queen and then pick up this bishop. But instead, my opponent goes to a1. And after bishop takes c3, we have rook takes c3, queen takes c3, king b1, and this bishop is going to fall on e3. And I'm simply up a piece at this point in the game. So it's pretty much the ball game. So I thought this was a good example of how this opening can have a very decisive attack and really active piece play. And it's a great example of how dangerous this opening can be if white chooses to play bird's opening. So I think that's going to be all for this video, but let me know if you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time.